I was standing on an 800-acre lake ranch I had just inherited when a legal notice hit my hand like a threat. The HOA claimed they had seized my land. They thought paperwork would scare me away, until a courtroom proved who really owned everything. If you believe real justice beats fake authority every time, subscribe. Because stories like this only surface when someone refuses to surrender what's rightfully theirs. The first thing I noticed about the ranch wasn't the size. It was the silence. 800 acres of water, grass, and shoreline stretched out in front of me, untouched and undisturbed, like it had been waiting. The lake reflected the sky without interruption, and the land carried a kind of still confidence that didn't need to prove itself. This place had history. It had weight. And now it was mine. I hadn't planned on inheriting it. The call came suddenly, wrapped in condolences and legal language. A relative I barely saw anymore had passed, leaving behind a property that most people wouldn't believe still existed so close to modern development. When I arrived, the contrast was immediate. On one side of the boundary, open land and water. On the other, manicured lawns, uniform fences, and identical houses governed by rules thicker than the deeds they were printed on. The attorney handling the estate walked me through the documents slowly, carefully. Clear ownership, generational transfer, no liens, no shared easements, no association authority. The ranch had always stood apart by design. Long before neighborhoods grew outward and committees formed inward, this land had been claimed, recorded, and respected. At least, that was supposed to be the case. The first sign of trouble came less than 48 hours after I took possession. A white envelope was taped to the gate. Official letterhead. Formal language. Terms like non-compliance, unauthorized use, and immediate action required printed boldly, as if volume could replace legitimacy. According to the letter, the homeowners association bordering the ranch had assumed management control of the property due to abandonment and zoning integration. Abandonment. The word lingered longer than it should have. I read the letter twice, then a third time. They weren't asking. They weren't suggesting. They were declaring. Declaring that my inherited land had fallen under their authority. Declaring that access was now restricted. Declaring that I would be required to comply with HOA regulations moving forward. I stood at the gate and looked out across the lake. Nothing about this place suggested abandonment. It was maintained, surveyed, alive. The only thing new was their confidence. Over the next few days, more notices appeared. Stakes were placed near the shoreline. Small signs marked community access, areas that had never existed. Contractors arrived briefly, took measurements, and left without explanation. Each action was subtle on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. This wasn't confusion. It was strategy. HOAs don't move fast unless they believe resistance will be slow. They rely on pressure, not force. Paperwork, not confrontation. They assume most people will back down when faced with complexity and cost. And in many cases, they're right. I requested a formal explanation. The response came quickly and confidently. The association claimed the ranch had been improperly recorded decades earlier. They cited updated zoning maps, development plans, and internal assessments. None of it came from the county. None of it came from a court. It came from them. What unsettled me wasn't the claim itself. It was how certain they were. Within a week, access points were blocked. Locks appeared where none had been before. A notice informed me that legal proceedings were underway to formalize transfer and usage rights. They weren't waiting for permission. They were creating reality through repetition. That was the moment I understood this wasn't a boundary dispute. It was a land grab disguised as governance. I hired counsel immediately, not to threaten, but to verify. Deeds were pulled, surveys reviewed, county records examined down to the original filings. Every document confirmed the same truth. The ranch had never been part of the HOA. Not legally, not historically, not accidentally. When my attorney contacted theirs, the tone shifted slightly, but not enough. They doubled down, insisting their interpretation would prevail under judicial review. That sentence told me they were already preparing for court. So was I. The lawsuit moved faster than expected. The HOA filed first, seeking declaratory judgment. They wanted the court to validate what they had already started enforcing. It was a gamble, one that assumed intimidation would outweigh evidence. They were wrong. Standing in that courtroom weeks later, I watched their case unravel piece by piece. Their maps conflicted. Their timelines collapsed under scrutiny. Their authority ended exactly where my deed began. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize the ruling. He simply stated facts. The ranch was mine. The seizure was unlawful. The HOA had no jurisdiction. The order was clear. Immediate removal of all controls. Restoration of access. Legal costs assessed against the association. When the gavel struck, it wasn't loud, but it echoed. Outside the courthouse, their representatives avoided eye contact. The confidence that had fueled their actions dissolved into paperwork and consequence. They hadn't just lost a case. They had exposed a habit of overreach that would follow them far beyond my land. I returned to the ranch that evening as the sun set over the lake. Locks were gone. Signs removed. Silence restored. The land hadn't changed. Authority had. And that was only the beginning. Winning in court doesn't end a fight. It exposes what comes next. The ruling had been clear, but clarity has a way of unsettling people who built confidence on assumption. When authority collapses suddenly, it doesn't disappear, it scrambles. The first sign came the following morning. My attorney forwarded an email chain that hadn't been meant for me. It was brief, panicked, and revealing. HOA board members arguing internally about damage control, insurance exposure, and whether the ruling could be interpreted narrowly. That last phrase stood out. People who lose cleanly still look for angles when they're not used to limits. I drove the perimeter of the ranch slowly, checking gates and access points that had been tampered with. Everything was open now, but the evidence of intrusion remained. Fresh tire tracks near the lake. Flattened grass where temporary walkways had been tested. Small details that told a bigger story. They hadn't just claimed the land. They had already started using it. That mattered. Court orders restore ownership, but they don't erase consequences. What the HOA had done wasn't just overreach. It was trespass, obstruction, and misrepresentation. Each action created liability. The question wasn't whether they had authority. That was settled. The question was what they would do now that they didn't. Within days, the association sent a formal notice to residents. Carefully worded, it framed the ruling as a jurisdictional clarification and emphasized continued commitment to community harmony. No mention of the attempted seizure. No acknowledgement of fault. Just narrative management. But narratives don't hold when facts circulate. Residents began asking questions. Why had the HOA acted without verification? Why had dues been discussed in relation to land they didn't own? Why had legal costs suddenly increased? The answers came slowly, if at all. Silence where confidence once lived. I didn't push publicly. I didn't need to. Systems under scrutiny tend to reveal themselves without pressure. All it takes is time. My attorney advised documenting everything. Not because another lawsuit was inevitable, but because patterns matter. Insurance carriers, oversight bodies, and courts all look for repetition. One mistake can be explained. A series becomes intent. The HOA's insurance carrier requested information. That alone signaled escalation. Carriers don't like surprises, especially when coverage assumptions collapse. Misuse of authority, unlawful control, and court losses change risk profiles instantly. Meanwhile, the ranch attracted attention of a different kind. County officials reached out to confirm boundaries and ensure no zoning conflicts existed. Their tone was neutral, professional, and thorough. They weren't there to challenge ownership. They were there to confirm the system had functioned correctly. It had. The contrast was striking. One body sought verification before action. The other had acted first and looked for justification later. The difference explained everything. A week after the ruling, A survey crew hired by the HOA arrived at the edge of the property. They didn't cross the boundary. They didn't announce themselves. They stood there, measuring, whispering, uncertain. I watched from a distance. After a few minutes, they left. Authority without permission is loud. Authority after correction is hesitant. I received another letter from the HOA's legal counsel. This one acknowledged the ruling and confirmed compliance. It requested assurance that I would not pursue additional remedies. The phrasing was polite. The intent was clear. I declined to respond. Silence again. Not avoidance. Leverage. In the weeks that followed, the association's internal fractures became visible. Board members resigned quietly. Meetings were postponed. Legal counsel changed. These aren't signs of health. They're signs of containment. Neighbors stopped by the ranch, some curious, others cautious. A few thanked me indirectly, sharing stories of pressure they'd endured for years. Fines issued without explanation. Threats of enforcement over ambiguous rules. None of it dramatic enough to make headlines. All of it heavy enough to wear people down. That was the pattern. Incremental control. The lake remained undisturbed, reflecting the sky with the same indifference it always had. Nature doesn't respond to paperwork. It responds to presence. I spent time there intentionally, not to guard it, but to reclaim it. Kayaking at dawn, walking the shoreline, restoring docks that had waited patiently for attention. Each act reinforced something simple. Ownership isn't proven in court alone. It's affirmed through use. The HOA attempted one final maneuver. A proposal surfaced to amend their bylaws to prevent future ambiguities. It included language broad enough to alarm anyone paying attention. But people were paying attention now. The proposal stalled. Resistance, once visible, spreads. I realized then that the lawsuit had done more than protect my land. It had recalibrated expectations. People had seen authority challenged successfully. That memory doesn't fade quickly. Months later, the insurance carrier issued revised terms to the HOA. Enforcement-related claims were excluded unless verified by independent legal review. Premiums increased. Oversight tightened. Behavior changed accordingly. No apology ever came. None was needed. The ranch stood free, not because I fought harder, but because I insisted on process when others relied on assumption. The HOA had seized land, believing confidence could replace consent. Courtrooms don't reward confidence. They reward evidence. As the season shifted, the water level rose slightly, reshaping the shoreline. Natural change, not imposed control. I watched it happen without interference. That felt right. The fight hadn't ended with the gavel. It had ended when the system corrected itself and learned restraint. And the people watching learned something too. Power doesn't come from claiming what isn't yours. It comes from knowing exactly where your authority ends. The real consequences didn't announce themselves with headlines or sirens. They arrived quietly, embedded in routine, altering behavior in ways only people who watch systems closely can see. The HOA hadn't just lost a case. It had lost momentum. And momentum, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. I noticed it first in the paperwork. Requests that once arrived with deadlines and penalties were replaced by questions. Emails that used to assume compliance now asked for confirmation. The language shifted from command to caution, from certainty to suggestion. Authority doesn't disappear overnight. It hesitates first. The ranch, meanwhile, began to draw attention from places the HOA couldn't influence. County assessors verified records again, not because they doubted them, but because the attempted seizure had raised flags. Zoning officials confirmed exclusions. Environmental officers reviewed lake protections. Every review ended the same way. Clean, clear, properly recorded. The land had been handled correctly for decades. The problem had never been the ranch. It had been ambition. My attorney advised restraint, not because further action wasn't justified, but because time was doing more work than confrontation ever could. When institutions overreach, the most effective response is often to let their own weight expose them. Scrutiny compounds quickly once it begins. The HOA tried to regain footing through optics. Community newsletters framed the court loss as a learning experience. Workshops on governance best practices were announced. Consultants were hired. None of it addressed the core issue. They were treating symptoms while avoiding diagnosis. Residents noticed. I received messages from people I'd never met, quietly at first, then more openly. Questions about fines issued years earlier. About notices that never cited statutes. About threats that seemed excessive but had gone unchallenged because no one wanted conflict. The pattern repeated across stories. Authority had been asserted broadly, rarely questioned, and slowly normalized. That normalization had been interrupted. The lake became a focal point again, not for conflict, but for clarity. I posted clear signage at the boundary. Not warnings. Statements of fact. Private property. No trespassing. Contact information listed plainly. Transparency removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is where control thrives. One afternoon, a group of residents gathered near the shoreline, staying well within their side of the boundary. They weren't confrontational. They were curious. The land had always been there, but now it symbolized something larger. Limits. Proof. The idea that not everything nearby belonged to the association. I didn't engage. Observation was enough. The HOA board met behind closed doors more often than not. When minutes were released, they were sparse. Vague references to ongoing matters. Legal counsel present at every meeting. Those are not signs of confidence. They are signs of containment. Then came the audit. It wasn't announced publicly, but it didn't stay private for long. Financial irregularities don't have to be criminal to be destabilizing. Legal expenses tied to enforcement. Insurance premiums rising sharply. Reserve funds redirected. All consequences of one decision to act without verification. The board chair resigned. Not abruptly, but deliberately, citing personal reasons. Others followed in staggered fashion. Leadership transitions are rarely coincidental. They happen when accountability becomes unavoidable. Through it all, I stayed focused on the ranch. Restoration projects advanced. Docks repaired. Trails cleared. The lake's edge reshaped gently where erosion had crept in. Care replaced defense. That shift mattered. Ownership expressed through stewardship is harder to challenge than ownership expressed through paperwork alone. The HOA attempted mediation. A neutral facilitator proposed a mutual understanding agreement to prevent future disputes. The language implied shared responsibility where none existed. I declined. There was nothing to negotiate. Jurisdiction had been resolved. Limits had been defined. Mediation is useful when both sides hold valid claims. It's unnecessary when one side has already been corrected by a court. Weeks turned into months. The neighborhood adjusted. Enforcement slowed noticeably. Notices were fewer. Fines were contested more often. The association responded carefully, aware that any misstep could reopen scrutiny. Oversight changes behavior faster than punishment. A county official stopped by one afternoon to close out a file. He confirmed everything was in order and thanked me for cooperation. Before leaving, he mentioned that cases like this often reveal more than they resolve. Not because of the land, but because of the habits they uncover. Systems grow accustomed to acting without resistance. When resistance appears, it forces recalibration. That recalibration was underway. The HOA's insurance carrier issued revised guidelines. Law enforcement contact now required documented verification of jurisdiction. Legal review became mandatory before any property action. Those policies didn't come from goodwill. They came from risk assessment. Risk had changed. I thought back to the first letter taped to the gate. The confidence it carried. The assumption that ownership could be overwritten by repetition. That confidence had evaporated, replaced by process and hesitation. The ranch remained unchanged by all of it. Water moved. Grass grew. Seasons shifted. Nature doesn't recognize authority claims. It recognizes care. The real victory wasn't the ruling. It was the shift that followed. People ask questions now. They read notices carefully. They understood that authority isn't self-validating. It has to be earned and maintained within limits. The HOA had seized land, believing no one would challenge them. They hadn't accounted for evidence, patience, and the quiet persistence of process. Those forces don't shout. They don't threaten. They simply wait. And when they act, they leave no room for argument. By the time autumn settled in, the situation had shifted from confrontation to consequence. Not the kind people expect, loud and final, but the kind that quietly rewrites behavior. The HOA no longer spoke in absolutes. Everything now came with qualifiers, footnotes, and legal review. That alone confirmed how deeply the court loss had landed. The ranch had become a reference point, even if no one said it out loud. When discussions arose about authority, boundaries, or enforcement, people thought of what had happened there. They remembered how quickly confidence had turned into liability. Memory, like that, reshapes decisions. I received a call from the county clerk's office requesting clarification on one detail in the public record. It wasn't a challenge. It was a precaution. When land disputes escalate to court, agencies double-check everything connected to them. The review confirmed what had already been decided, but the process mattered. It reinforced legitimacy at every level. Meanwhile, the HOA attempted to reassert relevance through community projects, landscaping initiatives, social events, volunteer drives, all harmless on the surface. But beneath them was an effort to redirect attention, to replace the image of overreach with one of service. Optics again. Optics don't erase records. The audit findings began circulating quietly. Not published, not announced, but discussed. Legal fees far exceeding projections. Emergency reserve withdrawals. Insurance adjustments tied directly to enforcement claims. None of it illegal. All of it consequential. Residents started asking why dues were increasing when services hadn't. Those questions didn't have easy answers. I was invited to attend a special meeting, not as an adversary, but as a stakeholder. The word choice was deliberate. It implied shared interest, shared responsibility. I declined again. Participation would have suggested unresolved issues. There were none. The board needed distance from me as much as I needed distance from them. At the ranch, restoration continued steadily. I hired local crews for repairs and maintenance, deliberately choosing people who lived nearby. Work creates connection, and connection reshapes narratives faster than arguments ever could. The land wasn't isolated anymore. It was integrated into the local economy without surrendering control. One afternoon, a former board member stopped by unannounced. Not confrontational, not defensive, just tired. He spoke carefully, acknowledging mistakes without naming them directly. He said they'd convinced themselves they were acting in the community's best interest. That phrase came up often in cases like this. Best interest, when undefined, becomes a blank check. I listened without interruption. Understanding doesn't require agreement. He left shortly after, saying nothing more. That encounter confirmed something important. Even those who benefit from unchecked authority eventually feel its weight. Control isolates the people who wield it as much as those subjected to it. As winter approached, the HOA announced updated governance policies, clear jurisdiction maps, mandatory verification steps, restrictions on enforcement actions without external review. They framed it as progress. It was correction. Correction doesn't need applause. Residents adapted quickly. Compliance shifted into engagement. Notices were questioned respectfully. Meetings saw higher attendance. Authority became conditional again, as it should have been all along. When people know limits exist, they operate within them more responsibly. The lake froze briefly during the coldest weeks, a thin sheet forming across the surface. It was temporary, fragile, but beautiful in its stillness. I walked the shoreline and thought about how quickly conditions change when pressure shifts. Ice forms quietly, not with force, but with consistency. That applied to systems too. The HOA's insurance carrier conducted a follow-up review. This time, their recommendations were stricter. Enforcement protocols rewritten. Training requirements imposed. Documentation standards elevated. Risk mitigation became the priority. When financial exposure enters the picture, reform accelerates. I received confirmation that the association had settled outstanding legal fees related to the case. They hadn't contested them. Contesting would have required reopening facts they no longer wanted examined. Silence, in that context, was acceptance. The ranch no longer appeared in any HOA communication. Maps were updated. References removed. It was as if the attempted seizure had never occurred. But erasure doesn't equal absence. Records remain, even when stories are edited. I didn't pursue damages beyond what the court ordered. That decision surprised some people. They expected escalation, retaliation. But escalation wasn't necessary. The system had already corrected itself more effectively than any additional lawsuit could have. Justice isn't always about extraction. Sometimes it's about restraint. As the year closed, the community felt different. Not transformed, but recalibrated. Authority functioned with awareness now. People understood that governance has boundaries just like land does. Crossing them carries cost. The ranch stood unchanged through all of it. It hadn't needed defense as much as recognition. Ownership, once clarified, doesn't require constant assertion. It exists quietly, reinforced by record, use, and respect. I realized then that the HOA hadn't truly lost in court. They'd lost earlier, when they assumed no one would challenge them. Court simply made that loss visible. The lesson extended beyond one association or one piece of land. It applied anywhere authority operates without scrutiny. Systems don't fail because rules exist. They fail when rules replace judgment. The lake thawed as spring approached, returning to motion without ceremony. Life resumed its natural rhythm. The conflict that had once dominated attention became a footnote, referenced occasionally, remembered clearly, but no longer active. That's how resolution should feel. Not triumphant, not bitter, just settled. And settled systems, like settled land, tend to endure. By spring, the dispute had faded from daily conversation, but its effects were everywhere if you knew how to look. Authority had slowed. Decision-making had become deliberate. The HOA no longer acted first and justified later. That single shift changed the atmosphere more than any announcement ever could. The ranch had become something of a quiet reference point. Not a symbol people talked about openly, but one they measured things against. When new rules were proposed, residents asked where jurisdiction ended. When notices were sent, people checked citations. The assumption of automatic compliance was gone, replaced by awareness. I spent most of my time focused on rebuilding, not reacting. Old structures that had been neglected during the legal chaos finally received attention. A dock that had warped over time was reinforced. Fencing along the far shoreline was repaired where storms had worn it down. Each task restored something tangible, grounding me in work that existed outside conflict. That separation mattered. It reminded me that disputes feel larger when they consume your identity. Stepping back into stewardship restored balance. One afternoon, a surveyor hired by the county stopped by unannounced. Not for enforcement, not for dispute, but for confirmation. Infrastructure planning required accurate records, and the ranch's proximity to development meant it was referenced often. He walked the boundary, reviewed markers, and confirmed alignment with official maps. Before leaving, he mentioned that updated records would reflect the ruling clearly, preventing future confusion. Prevention is the quiet side of justice. The HOA board announced another policy revision shortly after. Enforcement actions now required independent verification. Law enforcement contact demanded written confirmation of jurisdiction. Violations had to cite county statutes where applicable, not internal interpretations. These weren't voluntary changes. They were responses to oversight and liability. Residents noticed the difference immediately. Notices became rare. Fines were delayed, pending review. Meetings shifted from enforcement updates to maintenance planning. The association looked more like what it was supposed to be all along. I received fewer messages as time passed. The initial wave of curiosity and concern settled into something calmer. People had answers now. They understood where authority began and ended. That understanding reduced fear, and fear is what fuels unchecked control. Late one evening, I walked the shoreline as the sun dipped low, casting long reflections across the water. The lake was calm, its surface barely disturbed. It struck me how little the land had changed throughout all of this. Human conflict had come and gone, but the environment remained consistent, patient, unaffected by claims or rulings. That perspective mattered. The HOA attempted one last broad initiative, proposing expanded community access partnerships. The language was vague, carefully crafted to sound collaborative while leaving room for interpretation. But this time, residents pushed back immediately. Questions were raised. Legal clarification demanded. The proposal was withdrawn within days. That wouldn't have happened before. I realized then that the most significant outcome wasn't the court ruling itself. It was the shift in collective confidence. People no longer assumed authority was absolute. They understood it was conditional, bounded by law and record. That understanding spreads quietly, person to person, without announcements. My attorney closed the file formally, noting that all compliance requirements had been met. The HOA's counsel did the same. No further action pending. No appeals filed. Finality, documented and complete. I felt an unexpected sense of relief, not because I'd won, but because I no longer needed to think about winning at all. The ranch was secure. The system had corrected itself. There was nothing left to prove. Neighbors began treating the ranch differently, not as contested space, but as established fact. Invitations came in for local events. Contractors recommended services. The land reintegrated into the community without being absorbed by it. That distinction mattered. Integration without surrender. One morning, I found a copy of the original HOA notice still tucked away in a drawer. The one taped to the gate months earlier. The language seemed almost surreal now, so confident, so absolute. Reading it felt like looking at a relic from a different mindset. I didn't discard it. I filed it. Records matter even after resolution, especially after. The HOA's insurance renewal came up that summer. Premiums rose. Coverage tightened. Enforcement-related exclusions expanded. These changes weren't publicized, but they influenced every future decision. Financial pressure enforces discipline where principle sometimes fails. The board composition stabilized. New members brought a different tone. Less ambition, more caution. Meetings focused on tangible needs rather than abstract authority. The association became quieter, less visible. That's often a sign of healthier governance. The ranch thrived through it all. Wildlife returned to areas that had been disturbed during the attempted seizure. The shoreline healed. The land felt settled again, not because conflict was forgotten, but because it was resolved. I reflected often on how easily this could have gone differently. If I'd hesitated. If I tried to negotiate authority instead of verifying it. If I'd assumed confidence equaled legitimacy. The outcome would have been slower, messier, and far more costly. The lesson was simple, but rarely practiced. Authority must be verified before it's accepted. Ownership must be documented before it's challenged. Silence must be chosen carefully. As summer deepened, the lake reflected long days and quiet nights. I found myself no longer thinking about the HOA at all. That absence was the clearest sign of resolution. When systems work correctly, they fade into the background. The ranch had outlasted assumption, paperwork, and pressure. It had done so not through force, but through clarity. And clarity, once established, has a way of staying established. That was the real inheritance. By late summer, the conflict had transformed into something quieter and more permanent. Not resolution on paper, but resolution in behavior. The HOA no longer tested boundaries, not mine and not anyone else's. Authority, once loud and unquestioned, now moved carefully, as if aware it was being watched even when it wasn't. The ranch existed outside that awareness. It didn't need vigilance anymore. The locks were gone for good. The shoreline was clear. Access points stayed untouched. What had once felt like reclaimed territory now felt like home again. I noticed the shift in myself too. I stopped scanning the perimeter out of habit. I stopped keeping my phone close for emails that might pull me back into conflict. Instead, my days were filled with decisions that had nothing to do with defense. What to repair next? Where to restore native grass? Which parts of the lake needed attention before the season turned? Ownership, when uncontested, allows focus. The HOA's presence faded into routine. Their meetings continued, but without urgency. Notices came rarely, and when they did, they were precise, restrained, and carefully cited. Residents treated them differently now, not with hostility, but with informed caution. Questions were asked calmly. Answers were expected clearly. That mutual adjustment created a healthier balance than any ruling ever could. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visit from a county land use planner. Not for review or enforcement, but curiosity. He'd heard about the case and wanted to understand how an 800-acre property had remained independent through decades of development. We walked part of the boundary together as he listened. When I explained the original planning decisions, the deliberate exclusions, and the careful record-keeping, he nodded slowly. He said something that stayed with me. He said most disputes like this don't happen because records are unclear. They happen because people stop respecting them. Respect is a choice, not a requirement. The HOA had stopped respecting limits because no one had challenged them for a long time. Once challenged, they hadn't collapsed. They'd recalibrated. That distinction mattered. Correction is more durable than destruction. As the days shortened, the lake took on a different character. Mornings were cooler. Mist settled across the water before burning off under the sun. The land felt slower, more deliberate. I found myself thinking less about what had happened and more about what would come next. The ranch wasn't just a property anymore. It was a reminder of something larger. That systems are only as ethical as the people operating them. That authority unchecked doesn't usually explode. It creeps. The HOA had crept, increment by increment, assumption by assumption, until one day it crossed a line it couldn't erase. I thought about how many people had likely adjusted their lives quietly to avoid conflict, paid fines they didn't believe were fair, changed plans because arguing felt too expensive. That realization carried weight. It reminded me that resolution isn't just personal. It ripples outward. I received fewer messages from residents now, but when I did, the tone had changed. Less anxious, more confident. People knew what questions to ask. They knew where to look for answers. Knowledge had replaced fear. The HOA attempted no further expansions. No new integrations. No ambiguous proposals. Their insurance carrier remained closely involved, reviewing enforcement policies regularly. Oversight, once imposed, tends to linger. That oversight protected everyone, not just me. As fall approached, I prepared the ranch for the coming season. Drains checked. Structures secured. Equipment stored. These tasks felt grounding in a way paperwork never had. Physical preparation for real change, not imagined threats. One evening, while walking the shoreline, I noticed faint impressions where the HOA stakes had once been driven. Time had softened them, but they were still visible if you looked closely. Marks left by something temporary that believed itself permanent. I resisted the urge to erase them immediately, not because they mattered, but because they served as a quiet reminder. Power leaves traces, even after it's corrected. Eventually, rain and growth would erase them completely. Nature always finishes the job. The HOA's annual meeting came and went without mention of the case. New leadership spoke about maintenance goals, community projects, and financial planning. Enforcement was referenced briefly, cautiously, as a responsibility to be exercised within clear limits. The language wasn't dramatic. It was measured. That was progress. I closed the last open file related to the dispute and archived it properly. Not because I expected to need it again, but because records deserve respect. They tell stories accurately long after emotions fade. Standing on the ranch one late afternoon, watching the sun lower over the lake, I felt a sense of alignment I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Not vindication. Stability. The land was doing what it had always done. Holding water. Supporting life. Existing without explanation. The systems around it had finally adjusted to that reality. The HOA hadn't lost everything. They'd lost their illusion of unlimited reach. In exchange, they'd gained something more sustainable. Boundaries. Boundaries don't weaken systems. They define them. As the first leaves began to turn, I realized the conflict had ended the moment everyone involved accepted the same truth. Authority is temporary. Records endure. Ownership is not granted by confidence, but confirmed by fact. The ranch stood firm in that truth, just as it always had. And so did I. By the time the leaves fully turned, the situation had moved from resolution into memory. Not forgotten, but settled into the kind of past people reference quietly when making decisions. The HOA no longer tested limits, not because it feared another lawsuit, but because it now understood exactly where its reach ended. That understanding changed everything. I saw it in small, telling moments. A notice draft withdrawn before being sent. A board discussion redirected toward maintenance instead of enforcement. A resident openly questioning a proposal without hesitation or apology. Authority was no longer something that hovered. It was something that had to explain itself. The ranch existed outside all of that, steady and indifferent. I spent more time there than I had in years, not because I needed to protect it, but because I finally could enjoy it without distraction. Early mornings by the lake. Evenings repairing trails that had been neglected while attention was elsewhere. The land felt expansive again, not just in size, but in presence. Occasionally, someone would ask if I regretted not pushing further, not suing for damages beyond what the court ordered, not demanding public accountability. The question always came from the same place, a belief that justice has to be allowed to be real. I didn't share that belief. The HOA had been forced to change how it operated. Oversight had been imposed. Costs had been absorbed. Authority had been limited. Those outcomes would affect far more people, for far longer, than any headline ever could. Quiet correction lasts. One afternoon, I ran into a new board member at a local supply store. We didn't discuss the case directly. We talked about drainage issues, seasonal maintenance, practical things. But there was a subtle shift in tone. He spoke carefully, deliberately, as if every word carried weight. That wasn't fear. It was awareness. Awareness is what had been missing before. The association's insurance carrier conducted another routine review. This time, no red flags. Policies were being followed. Verification steps documented. Enforcement restrained. Risk stabilized. That outcome mattered more than blame ever would. It meant the system had learned. As winter approached again, the ranch prepared itself naturally. Grass thinned. Wildlife moved differently. The lake level adjusted with rainfall. Nothing rushed. Nothing forced. I matched that pace, letting the land set the rhythm instead of conflict. Looking back, it was clear how close this could have gone another way. If I'd accepted the first notice as legitimate. If I'd assumed complexity meant authority. If I tried to negotiate ownership instead of confirming it. The ranch might have been slowly absorbed without anyone noticing the moment it disappeared. That's how most losses happen. Quietly. The HOA hadn't planned to seize land outright. They'd planned to normalize control until resistance felt unreasonable. That strategy works more often than people realize. It only fails when someone pauses and verifies. Verification had been the turning point. The residents understood that now. They didn't view the HOA as an adversary, but they no longer viewed it as unquestionable either. That balance is healthy. Governance works best when it's engaged, not feared. I received fewer calls, fewer messages, fewer questions. People didn't need guidance anymore. They had confidence. Confidence built on clarity doesn't demand constant reinforcement. One evening, I walked to the far edge of the property, where the lake narrows into a quiet inlet. The water was still, reflecting bare branches and fading light. I thought about the idea of inheritance. It isn't just land or assets. It's responsibility, stewardship, the obligation to protect not just what you own, but how systems interact with it. The ranch had been protected not by force, but by insistence on process. That lesson would outlast me. The HOA's annual report was released quietly. Financials stabilized. Legal expenses reduced. Enforcement incidents minimal. The language throughout emphasized compliance with jurisdictional limits. Limits had become part of their identity. That was the real shift. The conflict that once felt consuming now felt distant, like a storm that had passed without leaving damage behind. Not because it hadn't mattered, but because it had been resolved properly. I closed out the last administrative correspondence and archived it. No loose ends. No pending actions. Finality achieved without spectacle. Standing on the ranch at dusk, I realized something simple. The land didn't need me to fight for it forever. It needed me to be present, attentive, and willing to say no when no was necessary. The HOA had seized land believing no one would stop them. They hadn't expected records to matter. They hadn't expected patience to outlast pressure. They hadn't expected the system to hold. But it did. And because it did, everything else fell back into place. By the time the year came full circle, the conflict no longer shaped the days. It had been absorbed into the structure of how things work now, quietly reinforcing limits without needing to be mentioned. That was how real resolution showed itself, not through reminders, but through absence. The ranch felt settled in a way that had nothing to do with court orders or letters. It was the kind of calm that comes when nothing is waiting to be challenged. Gates stayed open. Boundaries stayed untouched. No one questioned access because there was nothing to question anymore. Ownership had become ordinary again, and that ordinariness was the point. The HOA existed in a reduced, corrected form. Meetings were functional. Notices were rare and specific. Enforcement had become a last resort rather than a reflex. People no longer whispered about letters or fines. They talked openly, asked questions early, and expected answers grounded in fact. Authority had learned restraint, and restraint had restored credibility. I spent long mornings at the lake, watching light move across water that had been briefly claimed by people who didn't understand what ownership actually meant. The lake never belonged to them. It never resisted them either. It simply waited. Systems often underestimate patience. Patience doesn't announce itself, but it endures longer than pressure ever can. The ranch had become part of the community again without being consumed by it. Local crews handled maintenance. Nearby businesses benefited from steady work. Neighbors respected boundaries without being reminded. Integration happened naturally once control stopped being forced. Occasionally, someone new would move into the development and hear fragments of what had happened. The story was always incomplete when retold. An HOA mistake, a lawsuit, a court loss. What rarely carried through was the real lesson, that the conflict wasn't about land size or inheritance. It was about assumption. Assumption had driven everything. The assumption that land unused was land unowned. The assumption that authority could be extended simply because it hadn't been challenged before. The assumption that paperwork generated internally could override records established publicly. Every one of those assumptions had failed under scrutiny. The HOA hadn't collapsed. It hadn't been destroyed. It had been corrected. That mattered more than punishment ever would. A destroyed system leaves a vacuum. A corrected one leaves structure. I never framed what happened as a victory, even privately. Victory implies opponents. This had been about alignment, bringing behavior back into agreement with law and record. Once alignment was restored, there was nothing left to fight. The insurance changes remained in place. Oversight continued quietly. Financial caution shaped every decision the board made. Those mechanisms would protect residents long after memories faded. Consequences, when designed properly, outlast emotion. As winter returned, the lake took on its familiar stillness again. Frost edged the shoreline in the early mornings. Wildlife moved with practiced instinct. The land existed exactly as it always had, indifferent to claims, responsive only to care. I thought about inheritance often then, not as something received, but as something preserved. The ranch hadn't been protected by my presence alone. It had been protected by records kept long before me, by boundaries respected until someone forgot why they existed, and by a system that still worked when someone insisted it do so. That insistence had been quiet. It had been procedural. It had been patient. The HOA's attempt to seize the land had failed not because it was bold, but because it was careless. Carelessness doesn't survive scrutiny. It never has. On the final evening of the year, I stood at the same gate where the first notice had been taped months earlier. The wood bore no marks now, no sign of intrusion, no evidence of conflict, just a gate doing what it was meant to do, marking a boundary clearly, without explanation. I closed it gently and walked back toward the house, listening to the wind move across open space. There was no tension left in it, no unfinished business. The ranch had endured assumption, pressure, and overreach. It had outlasted all of it without changing itself. That was the quiet truth at the center of everything. Land doesn't need authority to exist. Authority needs limits to survive. And when those limits are enforced calmly and correctly, balance returns on its own. The HOA had seized land, believing it would go unnoticed. Instead, it reminded everyone of something essential. Ownership is not granted by confidence. It is confirmed by fact. And facts, once upheld, don't need defending again.